October 27th, 2007. Grand Forks, North Dakota. 38-year-old Joel Loveline and his fiancée attend a Halloween costume party at a local bar. When Joel takes a moment to step outside, he is beaten to death in the parking lot. The investigation leads to a suspect named Travis Stay, who was so intoxicated that night he cannot remember what happened. Travis goes on trial for Joel's murder, but when his defense diverts suspicion towards a group of costumed partiers, he is acquitted of the crime. After that, the trail went cold.
Hello everyone, and welcome to the latest episode of The Trail Went Cold. I'm your host, Robin Warder, and no, that was not my voice you heard during the intro. That was Scott Owings, the winner of our latest contest where listeners can earn a chance to narrate the opening of one of our episodes, and he did a tremendous job, so thank you very much, Scott. I have made this a recurring monthly contest, and I will provide more details about it at the end of this episode. Anyway, as you may have heard, I'm going to be spending the month of October covering unsolved cases which have a Halloween slant to them. Today's case is the unsolved 2007 murder of Joel Loveline, a man who was beaten to death while attending a Halloween party at a bar. What makes this case so unique is that there were multiple potential suspects who were all identified by the Halloween costumes they were wearing that night. In fact, a portion of a costume wound up being the key piece of evidence which led to a suspect who eventually went on trial for Joel's murder. However, that doesn't necessarily mean they got the right person. This case was featured on an episode of Dateline in 2013 titled Under a Halloween Moon, and since the murder is still officially unsolved, we're going to explore all the different angles and try to figure out who the real perpetrator might have been. However, before we get started, just a brief reminder that The Trail Went Cold is a weekly podcast which alternates between our regular full-length episodes like this one and shorter minisodes. We deliver either a new full-length episode or a new minisode every Wednesday. We're currently available for download on several platforms, including iTunes, Stitcher, and Google Play Music. So if you like this podcast, be sure to subscribe to it, and please leave a rating or a review, because that will help spread the word about us. The Trail Went Cold also has its own PayPal account and a donate button on the website. If there's anyone out there who wants to make a donation to us, we would greatly appreciate it, and we'll be sure to give you a shout-out on a future episode. So with all that out of the way, let us now examine the unsolved murder of Joel Loveline. Our story begins in Grand Forks, North Dakota in 2007. Our central figure is a 38-year-old technical systems analyst named Joel Loveline. Joel has a teenage daughter and a divorce under his belt, but he is currently engaged to his fiancée, Heather Eastling. On the evening of October 27th, the couple decide to attend a Halloween party at the Broken Drum Lounge and Casino. This is a costume party, so Joel dresses up as a hockey player, wearing the green jersey of his favorite team, the University of North Dakota Fighting Sioux. Shortly after 11:30 p.m., Joel received a call on his cell phone and stepped outside the noisy environment in order to answer it. A few minutes later, Joel returned to the bar and told Heather that he was going back outside to check on someone who had been left behind by a bus. So Joel left again, but shortly thereafter, a patron came running inside, shouting for someone to call 911. Everyone would soon be shocked to discover that Joel's body was now lying in the parking lot. He had been beaten so severely that several bones in his face were shattered, and he was covered in blood from what appeared to be a massive head injury. Joel was immediately rushed to the hospital, but it wasn't long before he was pronounced dead. It was ultimately determined that he died from choking on his own blood. Since Joel did not appear to have any offensive injuries on his hand, it seemed likely that he never got a chance to defend himself against whoever attacked him. In a cruel twist of fate, Joel had been scheduled to attend his teenage daughter's confirmation the very next morning. Police immediately arrived at the Broken Drum to investigate, and determined that there were at least 80 people at the facility at the time Joel's death took place. The key piece of evidence at the scene was a piece of yellow fabric found in the parking lot. It appeared to resemble a paw and had traces of blood on it. While witnesses recalled seeing a young man at the bar wearing a yellow hooded sweatshirt which seemed to match that paw. He also showed up on the bar's surveillance footage and could be seen leaving shortly before Joel went outside. Police sent out a plea for information, and within 2 days, Travis Stay, a 23-year-old nursing student from Princeton, Minnesota who was attending the University of North Dakota, came forward. He verified that he was at the Broken Drum that night, wearing a yellow hooded sweatshirt made up to look like a lion costume, which explained where the paw in the parking lot came from. By Travis's own admission, he had gotten heavily intoxicated, and in fact, there was a certain section of the evening where he had no memory at all of what happened. He claimed that he did have a tendency to black out if he drank a lot, and this was not the first time something like that had happened. On the evening of October 27th, Travis recalled walking out into the Broken Drum parking lot and being punched by a man dressed like a hunter. After this, he says he completely blacked out, and the next thing he remembered was arriving at his apartment in a taxi. At the time he was questioned, Travis did have bruises on his face and cuts on his hands. A taxi driver would later confirm picking up Travis about a mile away from the Broken Drum that night. He stated that Travis had bloody, shaky hands and was so out of it that he had to ask him his destination multiple times. In spite of his faulty memory, Travis was pretty certain that he had not harmed anyone that night. However, he raised the police's eyebrows when he told them that he had thrown out the yellow sweatshirt in the trash after he got home because it had blood on it. Police recovered the sweatshirt from the trash, and Travis willingly turned over the shoes and pants he wore that night. He also agreed to submit a DNA sample and gave investigators permission to search his apartment. There were traces of blood on Travis's shoes, and it was determined that the blood belonged to him. But a major revelation occurred when DNA testing was performed on the blood from Travis's clothing, and some of it turned out to be a match to Joel Loveleen. So a month and a half after the crime took place, Travis was arrested and charged with Joel's murder. It was theorized that the two men had gotten into an altercation in the parking lot, which ended with Travis beating Joel so severely that he wound up causing his death. While Travis was adamant that he did not do this, he still cannot account for a 1-hour window of time from that night when Joel's death would have taken place. In addition, another witness named Steve Rasaka came forward, who claimed that he was walking home from the Broken Drum when he noticed that he was being followed by a man wearing a yellow sweatshirt. Without provocation, this man made an attempt to punch Rasaka, but missed and fell to the ground. Rasaka ran into his house to grab a baseball bat to defend himself, but by the time he came back out, the man dressed in yellow had taken off. It seemed obvious the attacker was Travis, but he claimed to have no memory of this incident. So was it possible that Travis could have been so blackout drunk when he murdered Joel that he legitimately did not remember it? Well, in December 2008, Travis went on trial for murder, but his defense team had several key points which they believed supported their client's innocence. For starters, Travis was only 5'9" and 160 pounds, a much smaller individual than Joel, who was 6'4" and weighed 240 pounds. The defense found it unlikely that Travis was even capable of beating a man that large to death, particularly since Joel had no offensive wounds on his hands, indicating that he had never got the chance to fight back. And while Joel's blood was found on Travis's clothing, DNA testing also showed that none of Travis's blood was on Joel. The defense acknowledged that Travis was probably in the parking lot at the time Joel was killed, but was not responsible for his death. Their strategy involved pointing at some alternate suspects, and this is where the whole Halloween costumes angle of this story really comes into play. You see, these alternate suspects almost sound like the Village People, as they include a cowboy, a construction worker, a hunter, and a gangster rapper. And oh yes, there's also a clown, which only seems appropriate because at the time I'm recording this, the new movie version of Stephen King's It is playing in theaters and breaking box office records. Anyway, these suspects belonged to a party bus. On the night of the murder, a group of around 40 to 50 people in their 20s dressed up in Halloween costumes and proceeded to charter a bus to chauffeur them around town for an all-night pub crawl. It was established that this bus stopped at the Broken Drum before Joel was killed, but was already gone by the time police arrived. Needless to say, there was a ton of alcohol on this party bus, including an estimated 325 Jell-O shots. And yes, Travis Stay had originally been on the bus, but was not present when it drove away from the Broken Drum. Even though the bus had already left the scene, witnesses from the Broken Drum provided descriptions of some of the costumes the partiers were wearing, and this proved very helpful, since police were able to use this info to track them down for questioning at other bars in Grand Forks that night. The organizer of the party bus was 23-year-old Bryce Larson, who was dressed as a cowboy. When police found Larson and attempted to question him, he initially gave them a false name and birth date. In fact, he turned out to be so uncooperative and aggressive that he had to be handcuffed. After he calmed down and was told about what happened at the Broken Drum, Larson asked whether the guy who was killed had been wearing a green shirt with the initials UND, which of course accurately described Joel's hockey jersey for the University of North Dakota. The following day, Larson agreed to be questioned, but only via phone interview. He admitted that the party bus stopped at the Broken Drum, but denied having any involvement with what happened to Joel, and claimed that as the bus was leaving, he saw a guy in a UND hockey jersey talking to a man dressed in yellow. Of course, the man dressed in yellow would have been Travis Stay, and you might recall him claiming that he was punched out by a guy dressed as a hunter before he blacked out. Well, there was a guy in a hunter costume on the party bus named James Wavra, who corroborated Travis's story. He claimed that a guy dressed in yellow had grabbed him by the collar in the Broken Drum parking lot and pulled him to the ground. Wavra then said the guy took a swing at him and missed, so he punched the guy out. Bryce Larson then came over and told Travis that he wasn't allowed to get back on the bus, which would explain why he was forced to take a taxi home. However, Larson never mentioned this particular incident during his initial interview with the police. And now we move to the clown portion of the story. Another member of the party bus was a guy named John DeZiel, who dressed in a clown costume that night and was later tracked down by police at another bar after Joel's murder. DeZiel immediately captured their attention because he looked like he was crying and his hands appeared to be shaking. At one point, they heard him say, "I guess things got out of hand tonight." DeZiel claimed that he was crying because he just had a fight with his girlfriend, but when police brought him in for questioning, he became uncooperative and demanded his lawyer, so they let him go. When he was questioned again the following day, DeZiel now claimed that his tears had been caused by a flashback because the news of Joel's death triggered memories of an incident from a year earlier where he'd been jumped in a parking lot and knocked unconscious. Well, in spite of some questionable aspects of their stories, the investigations into Larson, DeZiel, and the party bus came to a halt once Travis Stay appeared on the radar. At trial, the prosecution pushed forward the theory that after Travis was punched out by James Wavra and left behind by the party bus, Joel attempted to help him. This would corroborate Heather Eastling's story about Joel returning to the bar and telling her he was going back outside to check on someone who had been left behind by a bus. However, Travis was so enraged about being punched out by Wavra that when Joel approached him, he decided to take out all his aggression on Joel by savagely beating him to death. But even though Travis had injuries on his hands from that night, the doctor who examined him would testify that the injuries were nothing more than superficial abrasions and did not indicate that he had severely beaten someone. There were also particles of grit found in Travis's cuts, so these cuts could have been caused by falling onto the asphalt rather than punching someone. A blood spatter expert initially believed that the blood on Travis's clothing came from delivering blows to Joel, but after reviewing a report by another bloodstain pattern expert, he acknowledged that it was possible for Joel's blood to have gotten on Travis's clothing without a physical confrontation, and that it could have innocently transferred if Travis happened to be close to Joel during or after he was attacked by others. Since the defense wanted to convince the jury that members of the party bus were responsible for Joel's death, many of them were called to testify. When Bryce Larson took the stand, he admitted that he initially lied and did not tell the whole story to police, but now admitted that he had an encounter with Joel Loveleen. According to Larson, he wanted to teach Travis a lesson for his attack on James Wavra, and enlisted the help of 2 other friends from the party bus, Mitchell Dolan, who was dressed as a gangster rapper, and Josh DeZiel, who was wearing a construction worker costume and also happened to be the older brother of the clown, John DeZiel. When the trio approached Travis, Joel appeared at his side to defend him. The 2 sides had a brief conversation which eventually turned friendly, as Dolan claimed that he and Joel joked about the rivalry between his favorite hockey team and the team featured on Joel's jersey, the UND Fighting Sioux. Larson then told Joel, "He's your problem now," before the group climbed back onto the party bus and drove away under the assumption that Travis must have attacked Joel after they were gone. But the defense produced a piece of evidence which poked a major potential hole in this story: the surveillance footage from inside the Broken Drum that night. It showed Joel exiting for the last time after speaking with Heather, but then featured John DeZiel, distinctly dressed like a clown, leaving the bar 3.5 minutes later. It was firmly established that DeZiel had left the scene on the party bus, so it was obviously still there the entire time he was in the bar, creating a window of at least 3.5 minutes, maybe more, when Joel, Travis, and the suspects from the party bus could have been outside alone together in the parking lot. The defense criticized investigators for not analyzing the clothing or shoes of any of the suspects from the party bus besides Travis. One of the detectives was called to the stand and admitted that the investigation had been operating under the mistaken assumption that the party bus had already left the scene before Joel was killed. If he'd known that Bryce Larson had mentioned a guy in a green hockey jersey during his initial encounter with police, they might have done things differently. For their part, the prosecution seriously attempted to downplay the involvement of the individuals on the party bus, stressing that there was no physical evidence linking them to Joel's death. No blood was found on the bus, and none of the other witnesses there recalled seeing blood on anyone else or any indication that a violent altercation had taken place. As far as the prosecution was concerned, all of the physical evidence pointed toward Travis Stay. They also called in Steve Rasaka to testify about Travis's unprovoked attack on him after leaving the bar that night. However, the defense found a way to use his testimony to their advantage. Rasaka and James Wavra both claimed that Travis had tried to punch them, but was so drunk that he missed and only wound up stumbling and falling to the ground. So if Travis was this incompetent at fighting, how would he have even been capable of beating a much larger man like Joel Loveleen to death? In the end, the defense did a very effective job of generating reasonable doubt. The jury was instructed that if they didn't find Travis guilty of murder, they must also consider manslaughter. But after deliberating for 6 hours, the jury found Travis not guilty on all counts. They stated that the prosecution's inconsistent timeline of events influenced their decision to acquit Travis, and they couldn't rule out the suspects from the party bus as being the real perpetrators. Travis eventually went on to become a law clerk for one of his defense attorneys, and while he has continually maintained that he did not kill Joel, he still claims to have no memory of the exact events which occurred that night. However, the prosecution and the police remained convinced that Travis was guilty of the crime. The individuals from the party bus were not considered suspects, and insinuated that the investigation was pretty much over. Indeed, ever since the trial, no other leads have been pursued, and some of the evidence from the case has flat out been destroyed. Most of Joel's loved ones continue to believe that the right man was put on trial, but got away with it. Since no one has been convicted of this crime, the murder of Joel Loveleen remains unsolved. So I guess you could say, the trail went cold. So it sounds like this will be one of those unfortunate mysteries where even though it's technically unsolved, the case is pretty much closed. As far as investigators are concerned, they got the right man the first time around and put him on trial, but since the jury decided not to convict him, there's nothing else they can do, because of course, Double jeopardy means that Travis Stay cannot be charged with the same crime twice. Now, as you well know, being acquitted at trial does not necessarily mean a defendant is innocent, but regardless of how you feel about this case, you have to acknowledge that the jury made the right call here, because it's clear that Travis was not proven guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. His defense team did a very effective job at presenting an alternate scenario where other suspects could have been responsible. They poked enough holes in the prosecution's timeline to hammer home the idea that the individuals from the party bus would have had the opportunity to kill Joel. And amusingly enough, since Travis wore a lion costume that night, it seemed like both the prosecution and the defense just could not resist the opportunity to keep using the word cowardly while describing the attack. One of the jurors did an interview after the trial and clarified that this wasn't a case where they believed Travis was guilty but thought the state hadn't proven its case. The vast majority flat out believed that Travis was innocent, and while one juror kind of thought Travis might have done it, they still voted for an acquittal because there was reasonable doubt. Truthfully, if police ever decided to charge someone else for this crime someday, it might be a challenge to definitively prove it in court because of the circumstances. So I'm going to look at all the different sides and try to figure out the most logical scenario for what happened. Now, admittedly, there are still good reasons to be suspicious about Travis, and you really cannot blame the police for zeroing in on him. All the physical evidence seems to point to Travis, and I'm sure it must have seemed awfully convenient that his alibi was, "I was so blackout drunk I don't remember what happened." At the very least, it seems obvious that he was present at the scene when Joel was killed, and that if he was able to provide a coherent account of what happened during that 1 hour period of time he supposedly blacked out, this case might have been solved a long time ago. While Travis seemed pretty certain that he did not harm Joel, I personally find the whole idea that you could kill someone while you're drunk and not even remember it absolutely terrifying. But to Travis's credit, he stood his ground and never once confessed to the crime. As you probably know, there are a ton of wrongful conviction cases out there in which the defendant falsely confessed to the crime. A lot of the time, they confess after being subjected to a lengthy interrogation from the police. Even if the defendant believes they're innocent, it can sometimes get to the point where police manage to convince them that they committed the crime, but have just blocked it out and do not remember it. There's actually another very famous Halloween murder case which has quite a few similarities to this one. In the early morning hours after Halloween night in 2001, a newspaper sports editor named Kent Heitholt was strangled and beaten to death in the parking lot of his workplace in Columbia, Missouri. Over 2 years later, the investigation led to a young man named Charles Erickson, who attended a Halloween party at a bar a few blocks away and consumed so much alcohol and drugs that he had no memory of that night. Erickson appeared on the radar because he started telling people he'd been having dreams that he and a friend named Ryan Ferguson, who was also at the bar with him that night, committed the murder together. After being interrogated by police, Erickson confessed to the crime and implicated Ferguson, and they were both charged with murder. Even though there was no physical evidence linking either of them to the scene, Ferguson was convicted after Erickson agreed to testify against him in exchange for a 25-year sentence. It seemed like Erickson genuinely believed that he participated in this murder, but years later, he would recant his confession. Even though Ferguson has had his conviction vacated and been released from prison, Erickson is still incarcerated, even though it seems blatantly obvious neither of them had any involvement in the crime, and that another suspect has gotten away with it. But yes, this is yet another case in which a person who got heavily intoxicated at a Halloween party got charged with a murder which took place in a parking lot. However, the key difference between these two cases is that even after he was subjected to interrogation by the police, Travis Stay never broke down and confessed. If the police pushed him hard enough, they might have been able to convince him that he committed the crime and did not remember it, but he consistently maintained his innocence. In fact, the jurors at his trial would say that one of the things which convinced them that Travis was telling the truth was his police interrogation video, because they thought he came off as very genuine. And remember, he was the one who willingly came forward when police said they were looking for a guy in a yellow hooded sweatshirt. He allowed himself to be interrogated without the presence of a lawyer, submitted a DNA sample, turned his clothing and shoes over as evidence, and allowed the police to search his apartment without a warrant, which is how they obtained the sweatshirt with Joel Loveline's blood on it. In retrospect, this definitely wasn't the smartest thing to do, but it demonstrates that Travis seemed 100% convinced he hadn't done anything wrong. A lot of the other things which point away from Travis were mentioned at his trial, and I gotta say, his lawyers did a pretty stellar job. When it came out that Travis tried to attack Steve Rasaka without provocation after he left the bar, it was very easy to assume that Travis was this violent maniac who was trying to kill everyone he crossed paths with. But when the defense brings up the fact that Travis was so intoxicated that he failed to land a single punch while attacking two separate people, it just doesn't seem plausible that he could fatally beat Joel Loveline and that Joel could not deliver a single offensive blow against a clumsy drunk who was 5 inches shorter and 80 pounds lighter than him. So yeah, while I definitely understand why the police focused on Travis, this did cause them to develop a case of tunnel vision and stop pursuing other potential leads. Before Travis came forward, there were already noticeable red flags during their questioning of Bryce Larson and John DeZiel. In addition to being very aggressive when police initially approached him, Larson brought up Joel's green hockey jersey, even though his death occurred a very short time before this, and there's no way Larson should have known this detail unless he had been there. And DeZiel's multiple explanations for the crying and shaking when he was originally questioned by police are pretty unbelievable. He seemed visibly upset by something which happened that night. Now, one key point which seemed to support the narrative of the party bus leaving the Broken Drum before Joel was killed is that the last time Joel spoke with Heather, he said he had to step outside to check on someone who had been left behind by the bus. However, since surveillance footage showed John DeZiel exiting the bar over 3 minutes after Joel, the party bus clearly had to still be there. So I guess it's possible that Heather misheard or misunderstood Joel, which would make sense considering that it's a noisy bar. But I think it's more likely that Joel was outside talking on his phone when he witnessed the altercation between Travis and James Wavra and overheard Larson saying that Travis wasn't allowed back on the bus. When Joel went back to speak to Heather, he might have been under the mistaken impression that the bus was leaving, but when he returned outside, he saw that Larson, Mitchell Dolan, and Josh DeZiel were still there, possibly ganging up on Travis as retribution for his attack on Wavra. When you look at the timeline, 3.5 minutes is enough time for Joel to approach them, things to get out of hand, and for John DeZiel to exit the bar and possibly witness the traumatic sight of Joel getting savagely beaten. Now, admittedly, if there's one thing which bothers me about the idea of these suspects being responsible, it's that there were around 40 to 50 people on that party bus, and none of them mentioned seeing any blood or anything out of the ordinary to suggest a violent beating had taken place. I know people will cover for each other in these type of situations, but I find it hard to believe that 40 to 50 people could have remained silent about something like this after all these years. I guess it would depend on where the bus was parked, and if it was in a spot where Joel's death would have been out of view for everyone else. And remember, this was a bus full of drunk people, and it was dark, so if Larson, Dolan, and the DeZiel brothers were visibly shaken when they climbed back onto the bus, maybe no one else even noticed. I also think it's possible that these guys could have beaten up Joel and left without knowing how serious the situation was, and did not even realize Joel was dead until the police tracked them down later on. But really, which scenario sounds more believable to you? James Wavra punches out Travis, Joel tries to help him, but Travis is so enraged by the incident that he takes it all out on this innocent Good Samaritan and beats him to death. Or, Wavra punches out Travis, but Larson and his pals decide they want to beat him up some more until Joel intervenes to help Travis, prompting the party bus crew to gang up on him and beat Joel so severely that they wind up killing him before they hightail it out of there. During the chaos, possibly while making an attempt to help Joel, Travis winds up getting Joel's blood on his clothing before he leaves the scene and heads home. When Travis wakes up the following day, he has no memory about what happened. Once you eliminate the bizarre detail about Travis's blackout, the first scenario just sounds so much more believable. But I think if this case got reopened, the biggest obstacle would be figuring out who to prosecute. Even though Travis's attack on Wavra seemed to be the instigator of this whole incident, his defense team believed that Wavra had no direct involvement in what happened to Joel and likely returned to the bus before the beating took place. At the very least, John DeZiel probably witnessed what happened when he exited the bar, but it's tough to know if he actively participated in the attack on Joel. So that leaves Larson, Dolan, and Josh DeZiel as the primary suspects, but how exactly do you determine who did what? If you tried to go after these guys, they could all just claim they were there, but that it was the others who actually performed the beating. I think the only way to prosecute anyone would be if one of them decided to accept a plea deal and testify against the others, but how do you prove who's telling the truth and who isn't? There was no physical evidence at the scene pointing to any of them, and like I said earlier, a lot of the evidence they did have was just thrown away after Travis's trial. I think the only way to get a conviction is if any independent eyewitnesses saw the incident and are willing to come forward and testify. It's likely that John DeZiel saw what happened, but it's very doubtful that he's ever going to roll over, particularly since one of the suspects is his own brother. I guess the only hope would be if someone else from that party bus saw something and has been keeping silent all these years. But sadly, this all might be a moot point if the state isn't willing to admit that they prosecuted the wrong man the first time around and pursue other suspects. It's obvious that Travis Day made some serious mistakes that night, but when you see his interviews on Dateline, he does come across like a pretty decent young man who hopefully learned a major lesson from this incident and can live a successful life. While it's a horrible tragedy that Joel Loveleen wound up dead, I think this demonstrated a lot about his character because he tried to intervene and help a smaller, defenseless man from being ganged up on by 3 or 4 people. But unfortunately, it sounds like a bunch of drunken jackasses killed him for it. You have to feel immense sympathy for Joel's family, particularly his daughter, whom he was very close to. Heather Eastling and Joel's ex-wife actually wound up bonding over this tragedy and became good friends, but they remain convinced that Travis was the guilty party all along. This is actually fairly common in wrongful conviction cases, where a victim's loved ones will continue to believe that an exonerated defendant was guilty, even if the evidence strongly suggests otherwise. Under the circumstances, I can't blame Joel's family, because the alternative would be the realization that someone else out there has gotten away with his murder and will never face justice for it. I guess the only thing that will force the authorities' hand and close this case is if someone makes a full confession, or if anyone who witnessed what actually happened that night comes forward. So if you have any information about the unsolved death of Joel Loveleen, please contact the appropriate authorities. Anyway, like I mentioned in the intro, I have now made it a recurring monthly contest for one of our listeners to win the chance to recite the opening narration on an episode of The Trail Went Cold. If you've already entered this contest before, you are still eligible for my next random drawing, so you don't have to do anything. But if you want to enter this contest and haven't already done so, all you have to do is send me an email under the subject line Trail Went Cold Contest, naming the one unsolved cold case you would most like to see covered on this podcast. This month's winner, Scott Owings, actually sent me a suggestion for a really interesting case which I've been wanting to cover for some time, so you'll be seeing a new episode about it in November. So once again, feel free to send me an email under the subject line Trail Went Cold Contest to robin.warder@icloud.com. That's robin.warder@icloud.com. Want to give a shout out to my loyal listeners and supporters out there, especially those from the Unsolved Mysteries message board at the Sitcoms Online forum and the Unresolved Mysteries subreddit.
And since we've entered a new month, I'd like to take a moment to thank all our listeners who have signed up for recurring monthly donations. And they are Dawn, Amber, Brian, Casey, Ellie, Kathleen, Keisha, Laura, Alice, Clinton, Lewis, Jennifer, and Carol. So thank you so much, folks, for your generosity. And before we bring things to a close, I would like to play a promo for a fairly new podcast called Trace Evidence. This is one of the most thorough and detailed true crime podcasts out there, and it has even gone in depth into some of the cases we have featured right here on The Trail Went Cold. Have a listen.
Hi, this is Steven, the host of Trace Evidence, a true crime podcast focused on missing persons and unsolved murders. If you're a true crime fan like I am, then you're haunted by the questions for which there are no answers, and the names of the victims who so rightfully deserve them. Kurt Sova, Tara Calico, Lauren Spear, Rico Harris, Suzanne Joven, Dorothy Scott, Jesse Ross, Sky Metawalla, Patricia Docker, Rachel Trelisa. You may know their names, But do you know their stories? Trace Evidence is available on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Google Play Music, and more. Visit trace-evidence.com for more information.
I need to provide my thanks to Miguel Foote, who edits and assembles this podcast together for me, and Vince Nitro, who composes the eerie music you hear on every episode. And you may have noticed that he's composed a much creepier version of the Trail Went Cold theme for the month of October for Halloween, so I hope it's giving you nightmares. If you haven't already, you can like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter, or leave us a rating or review on iTunes, Stitcher, or Google Play Music. We also have a Facebook discussion group, so if you feel like discussing the podcast or the cases we feature with myself and your fellow listeners, feel free to join, and I'll approve your entry into the group ASAP. Like I mentioned earlier, we have a donate button on our website, so if you're feeling generous and want to express your appreciation for all the hard work we put into this podcast, we'd be extremely grateful. So have yourself a good week, and join me next Wednesday for another Halloween-themed minisode of The Trail Went Cold.